My name is Father Joshua Wagner, and this is my first attempt at making a video response to one of the questions I've received on StumpThePriest.com. I am the priest that you are trying to stump. I will also be doing podcasts, audio responses at times, and I will also be doing written responses, so you can send them to your friends and family, neighbors, pets, whoever you decide to send them to. Today's question regards the perpetual virginity of Mary, and it says, "We believe as Catholics that Mary was a perpetual virgin, although the Scripture says she did not have relations with Joseph until after the baby was born. I'm sure this is a problem with the English translation of the word until, or we would have to say that she went on to have more children, which leads to the other misinterpretation of the word brother in the New Testament. Can you help us clear this up? Thanks." It's a very good question. In fact, the perpetual virginity of the Blessed Virgin Mary is a problem that our Protestant brothers and sisters certainly have without any sort of real necessity of having that problem. They think that Mary had other children, according to what the Scripture says Jesus saw his brothers and sisters. Adelphoi is the word that they use there. Adelphoi not only means brothers and sisters, but it means all of your family, all of your kin. So certainly that word narrowed down in our language could mean specifically siblings, but it doesn't have to. There's also nothing saying that Joseph wasn't married before. That's not in the tradition or anything like that, but it's very possible that Jesus had older brothers and sisters. The perpetual virginity of the Virgin Mary is really important in a lot of ways, because how can we say this? The perpetual virginity of the Virgin Mary is not only a matter of our tradition, but it's a matter of the Scripture as well. And I've actually come up with an argument that talks about the fact that Mary not only remained a virgin, but she intended to remain a virgin. In fact, she made a vow of virginity. We can see this from the Scriptures. If we go to the Gospel of Luke, and we look in the first chapter, there's two things I want you to sort of think about when you read the first chapter of Luke. And there's two Annunciation stories in that particular Gospel passage. The first one we hear about is Zechariah receiving the announcement that John the Baptist is going to be born. And the second is the Annunciation of Jesus Christ by the angel Gabriel to Mary. Now, they don't seem like you could relate them to this particular question, but I actually think that it's very important. And of course, this is my own theory. Maybe somebody else has come up with this too. Let's look at these two separate stories, and we can talk about the perpetual virginity of Mary through them. Zechariah, let's look at the context that they're in. Zechariah is a very old man. By our standards, who knows how old he is, but by our standards, he'd be a man in his 60s or at least 70s, you know? And he was a guy who had lived his entire life with his wife Elizabeth, and they had never conceived a child, which, by the way, was considered a curse to people back then. I mean, children were everything. It's the way you not only perpetuated your own bloodline, but kept the culture going as well. Elizabeth was also a very old woman. So we have two very elderly people here. By our standards, we don't really know how old they were, but not only was Elizabeth barren, but she was well beyond childbearing years anyway. He's doing his service in the temple, and this angel comes to him and says, "You're going to have a son with your wife Elizabeth." Now, if you're a 70-year-old man with a 70-year-old wife, what is your reaction going to be? Well, his reaction was exactly right. He looks at the angel and he says, "How is this supposed to happen? You know, my wife has been barren for her entire life, and now you're going to tell me as an old man that we're going to conceive a child together." Perfectly legitimate question. But the angel's response is very interesting. It's because you haven't believed you will be stricken mute until the day the child is named. And it's a strange response because it was a very legitimate question for him to be asking. Well, let's take that and compare that now to the Annunciation to the Blessed Mother of Jesus. Same kind of thing. The angel comes and announces to Mary exactly what is going to take place, that she's going to conceive and bear a son. And her reaction is the exact same as Zechariah's. She asks the question. She says, "How's this supposed to happen since I don't know man?" Well, you know, that seems to be a legitimate question in the sense that you have this woman who is engaged or betrothed or hasn't had any sexual relations with anyone yet, you know. It's a perfectly legitimate question. But you also have this question coming from a 14-year-old, 15-year-old girl who is engaged, who's about to move in with her husband, who's about to start their common life together. Now, if you told a newlywed that you're going to have children, it shouldn't be a surprise to the newlywed. In fact, they look at you and go, well, of course we are. I mean, that's sort of the next logical step. Not only that, but look at Mary. She's 14, 15 years old, or at least a teenager, at least a young woman. And you know she has cousins and friends who have gotten married or are getting married, or older cousins or whomever. And what's the first thing that happens to them is they get pregnant? Either Mary was really, really dense, or she's asking a very serious question here. And the question is, how am I supposed to conceive a son when not only do I not know a man or have relations with a man, but I intend not to? This is why the angel explains to her how it's going to happen. It's my theory that Mary had already made a perpetual vow of virginity. There's some apocryphal literature, that is literature that's not in the Bible, that seems to indicate that Mary spent some time in the temple. In fact, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, third altar to the left, there's a mosaic of the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She's running into the arms of the high priest. This is certainly something that I think warrants us to look at, because not only did she not understand how she was going to have a child, because she wasn't technically married at that point, but it's a dumb question for her to ask. You see, when we contrast these two Annunciation stories, I think it's interesting, because Zechariah had every right to ask that question. And a newly wed, or at least engaged woman, who knows what happens to newly engaged and married women, they have kids, she has no right to ask that question. Yet, Zechariah is stricken mute, and she, on the other hand, goes to Elizabeth's house and begins to sing. You know, Zechariah doesn't sing until after John is named. This is my own personal argument for the fact that Mary asked the question because she knows that God knows that she already made a perpetual vow of virginity. So if we think about that, if we think about that contrast, it makes sense that she would continue to make that vow of virginity after her, or keep the vow of virginity after the birth of Christ. So the idea of until really isn't discussing so much when the Scripture said she had no relations with the man until Christ was born. It's really underlying the fact that she was a virgin, that Christ was not conceived in the typical way that children are conceived, that is through sexual relations. The Scripture wants to underline that this is a virgin birth. And it wants to underline this fact because of the prophecies found in Isaiah and things like that. As for kin afterward, and I have another sort of argument for that, and this is my own personal argument, but maybe somebody else has come up with it, maybe I heard it somewhere else, is that if Mary had other children, the whole exchange between John and Mary at the cross, you know, woman behold your mother, and man behold your mother, and woman behold your son, would never have had to happen. I have a theory that the reason Jesus did that was not only in a symbolic way, you know, to give Mary to the entire church, but also he's protecting her legal rights. As she's attached to John, she continues to have legal rights within the law, within the culture, because a woman by herself was basically powerless, you know, in the culture. She had to be attached to a man. So my other theory about this, and again I could be off base, but my other theory about this is that if she had other sons, that exchange would not have been necessary. It's not only a symbolic thing for the church, but it was a juridical thing to protect the rights of the Blessed Virgin Mary. You can take that or leave that. You can take or leave either of these arguments. But what is important is in our tradition, big T tradition, that Mary continues to be a virgin for the rest of her life. And that's simply because she was prepared to bring Christ into the world. And you don't put anything else there. She is special. She's the Ark of the Covenant. You don't just throw anything else into the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark itself is very important and very precious and very venerable and should be respected and completely was respected. This not only appears in the tradition, but again, these apocryphal books that appear 100 or 200 years after Christ also have stories of that support her perpetual virginity. Again, this is probably not, as I like to make the disclaimer in all my answers, an exhaustive answer, but it's one I hope that you can think about in terms of the fact that Mary asks what should be kind of a dumb question in her Annunciation narrative. But it makes perfect sense if she made a perpetual vow of virginity. Thanks. StumpThePriest.com. And if you want to email me a question. I only answer one a week because I don't have time for anything else.